The Nakajima Ki-27, also known as the Nate or the Abdul, was a low-wing monoplane fighter used by Imperial Japan in the late 1930s. In 1935, Nakajima found itself competing against Kawasaki and Mitsubishi to design a new low-wing monoplane for the Japanese Army. The mainstay of the Army Air Force, the Ki-10, was almost brand new, but it was already considered obsolete, and the Japanese Army, with its expansionist ambitions, needed something modern to support its ground troops and dominate the air. In this development contest, Nakajima actually had the advantage of a head start. After their failure in the previous competition that had led to the development of the Ki-10, Nakajima's engineers had quietly started work on a private design designated Pursuit Experimental. This they used as their submission to the Army Air Force in 1935, where it was designated Ki-27. Following on was Kawasaki's submission, which was designated Ki-28, and then Mitsubishi came with the Ki-33. Despite the recent appearance of some very modern-looking fighter designs in other countries, some of whom could definitely be considered future rivals to Japan, part of Nakajima's design appeared to be decidedly outdated, which could almost be considered a metaphor for Japanese military development in the mid-1930s, with modernists and traditionalists squabbling like a pair of enraged children, whilst the military manufacturers quietly wept in the corner. Originally, the only outward outdated part of the design was the feature of an open cockpit, and in fact this was something often preferred by pilots at the time, as many earlier enclosed cockpits had large struts that obscured their vision. The Ki-27 was to originally feature a new liquid-cooled engine and was to come with a retractable landing gear as well. However, there were some concerns amongst the conservative army staff about some of these innovations, and to be fair, some of them were well-founded. Their primary concern was aircraft endurance and maintenance. They wanted the Ki-27 to be as light as possible and as reliable as possible. The engine was the first thing to be changed in respect to this, with the Army pressing for an air-cooled radial engine instead. To help further improve cooling and aerodynamic control, the Ki-27 would be the first Japanese aircraft to be fitted with cowl flaps as well. The other main concern was the retractable landing gear. It was complex, and it was heavy, and many locations where the Ki-27 was to be operated had very rough terrain. A fixed landing gear would allow the aircraft to sustain rougher impacts on unpaved landing strips, and save weight at the same time, and it was also modified to be as aerodynamically shaped as possible. Maneuverability was the other high priority with this new design, and Nakajima introduced what was to become their signature wing shape with the Ki-27. The leading edge of the wing was a straight line, and the trailing edge was tapered with a slight forward angle. The straight leading edge was designed to reduce or prevent the risk of tip stalls, and as the Ki-27 was designed with tight turning in mind, this would be a critical part of its design. The wing loading was also reduced as much as possible to improve its aerial performance, with holes being bored into parts of the internal wing and fuselage struts to reduce every gram of weight they could within safety standards. The result was a very light, very nimble fighter that looked perhaps a bit old school with the fixed landing gear and open cockpit. The Ki-27 first took to the air on October 15, 1936, and immediately took place in a series of competitive military trials competing against aircraft from Kawasaki and Mitsubishi. Nakajima would end up winning the competition, of course, as history now tells. Kawasaki's Ki-28 was faster, but suffered reliability problems from its water-cooled engine. Mitsubishi's Ki-33 was also faster, even though it used the exact same engine as the Ki-27, but it wasn't faster by much, and it was considerably less maneuverable than the Ki-27 was. Afterwards, Kawasaki and Mitsubishi both complained about the result of the competition, claiming it was unfair that Nakajima had a head start with their design. The two companies helped to convince the army not to hold any more open design contests, but instead ask a single company to produce each further design. This backfired hilariously for them, as the army promptly selected Nakajima as their preference, awarding them contracts to develop the Ki-43, the Ki-44, and the Ki-84. After the trials were complete, the army ordered a pre-production run of 10 aircraft, and more tests were conducted to further improve its maneuverability and reliability. These aircraft were produced and delivered over the course of 1937, and the Ki-27 was ordered into production as the Army Type 97 fighter on the 28th of December 1937. When the Ki-27A entered service, it had very good performance for the theatres it was expected to operate in. It was powered by the famously reliable Nakajima Kotobuki 24-litre 9-cylinder radial engine, which produced around 710 horsepower. This gave the Ki-27 a maximum speed of 470 km an hour at 11,500 feet, and a cruising speed of 350 km an hour. It was armed with a pair of 7.7mm Type 89 machine guns, which for the time was already being considered somewhat light, but as most aircraft still lacked armour protection for the pilots or self-sealing fuel tanks, this was deemed an acceptable amount of firepower. The aircraft had a single fuel tank mounted in the wing, which gave it a range of 339 nautical miles. This range was considered on the lower end of ideal by the Army, and they pressed Nakajima to install a second fuel tank behind the pilot. Nakajima refused on the grounds that it would A. ruin the aircraft's centre of gravity, and B. pose an unacceptable risk to the pilot as the tanks were not self-sealing. They compromised on the decision to fit the Ki-27 with the first auxiliary drop tanks that would be fielded by Japan. The Ki-27 first saw combat over the skies of China. On the 3rd of April 1938, the first operational units were delivered to the region, and their combat debut occurred on the 10th of April, where a formation of Chinese I-15 biplanes was attacked by 3 Ki-27s. Over the course of the year, Japanese units operating the older Ki-10s gradually changed over to the new monoplane, and they experienced a period of air superiority. This forced the Chinese and Soviet volunteers to switch to higher altitude bombing, which then reduced the effectiveness of said bombing due to the reduced accuracy. Their fortunes would not entirely be reversed, but at least equalized when the new Soviet I-16 fighters began appearing in larger numbers. The Ki-27 and the I-16 would clash again during the Battle of Khalkin Gol, which would include the largest air battle since 1918. At the beginning of this conflict, the Japanese aircraft in the region greatly outnumbered the Soviets, and at the start they decided to husband some of their forces to see how the Russians would react. Nevertheless, in the opening phases they enjoyed a high level of superiority, with many Ki-27 pilots already veterans of air combat over China. This was helped by the fact that many of the I-15s and I-16s deployed to the region were older models, with the newer cannon-armed variants being prioritized for the Spanish Civil War. Gradually, the Soviets introduced the cannon-armed I-15 and I-16s to the region. This, combined with a change in flying tactics, evened the field, and Japanese losses began to mount alongside the Soviets. It is difficult to get an exact figure for the total losses on both sides, as each had a habit of exaggerating them to their own benefit, but it is claimed that the Soviets lost around 1,300 aircraft compared to just 120 for the Japanese. It's a ratio that certainly raises a few eyebrows, but then you also have things like the case of the Japanese ace Hiromichi Shinohara, who was the first pilot in history to not only become an ace in one day, but also shoot down more than 10 aircraft in a single day. He achieved a total of 58 victories in the Ki-27 in the space of 3 months, earning him the nickname Richthofen of the Orient, before he too was shot down on the 27th of August 1939. 1939 also saw the introduction of the Ki-27B. The most significant physical change was the fully glazed, fully enclosed canopy, and the addition of an oil cooling system. The aircraft was now able to carry up to 4 25kg bombs, or 2 drop tanks that combined could carry an additional 226 litres of fuel. This extended the range of the aircraft up to 593 nautical miles. It also had an additional, more powerful 12.7mm Ho-103 machine gun. By December 1941, the Ki-27 was considered to be obsolete, but it was still the most important and the most numerous fighter in service with the Japanese army. As a result of this, the Ki-27 featured prominently in the Japanese offensives over Malaya, Burma, and the Philippines. Many Allied aircraft in the area were as equally obsolescent. However, the Ki-27's success was more due to strength of numbers rather than being the superior aircraft. Brewster Buffaloes defended Malaya, and their maneuverability was more than a match for the Ki-27. The deciding factor came down to the experience of the pilots. Many Buffalo pilots had basically zero combat experience compared to the Japanese pilots who had been battle-hardened over China and Mongolia. The Ki-27 encountered real trouble in Burma, where it came up against Brewster Buffaloes and P-40s in numbers that were operated by the RAF and the American Volunteer Group. The Allies were still hopelessly outnumbered though, to the tune of 5-1 in Japan's favour, but experiences from Malaya had taught them much about dealing with the Ki-27. The aircraft was as nimble as a cat, but it was slow, so as long as they avoided the temptation of being dragged into a protracted dogfight where they could be outturned, they would be fine. The powerful armament of 6 50 cal machine guns on the P-40 also did shocking damage to the light and therefore relatively weak airframe of the Ki-27. On paper, the Allies fared significantly better than Japan in the skies above Burma, but Japanese victories on the ground soon denied them of any effective airfields to press home their advantage. The Ki-27 was phased out of frontline service over the course of 1942. It would be replaced by Nakajima's newer designs, the Ki-43 and the Ki-44. There were large numbers of surviving Ki-27s due to its long production run, and these were used as training aircraft. Additional trainers were also built in Manchukuo, with about 1,300 being built by the time production ceased. Near the end of the war, the Ki-27 would see frontline service again, as Japan in its desperation began to employ the use of kamikaze attacks. The Ki-27 was used for this purpose, but some were also pressed back into conventional service to try and help intercept the massive bombing raids that were now levelling cities across the home islands. Two examples of the aircraft survive today. One Ki-27 is preserved at the Takiare Peace Memorial Museum in Japan, and the other, a training aircraft, is at the Satria Mandala Armed Forces Museum in Indonesia.